Hi, my name is Richa. I'm a graduate of the Faculty of Education at University of Cambridge, and I'll be presenting my paper today that interrogates the idea of equity in education for sustainable development. So my rationale behind this paper was to engage in a critical literature review that engages with the discipline of environmental education against the background of climate change. Now, the UN Sustainable Development Goals pledge for a brighter, more just and equitable future to be reached by 2030 in order to leave no one behind. Now, this pledge of leaving no one behind is, of course, very much embedded in the idea of equity. And the UN SDGs identify education of sustainable development as a cross-cutting area of research, policy, and practice for achieving this future. Therefore, based on its conceptualization of equity, I ask whether ESD as a tool is fit for achieving the pledge of leaving no one behind. In the paper, I argue that it's actually not. I argue that ESD, in fact, suffers from a design flaw in that it is embedded in the ideology of neoliberalism. And what that does is that it espouses a very narrow concept of equity that is top down in nature, that sees equity as a byproduct of economic growth, and that sees equity merely as distribution of natural resources. Now, the key problem with ESD is that it has multiple definitions across international organizations and across countries, which means that it falls in this conceptual gray area, or as scholars call it, an elusive thematic group of issues. What this ambiguity around ESD does in international discussions is that it raises it to a key principle, which is very easy to debate on because it's so broad. Therefore, it's easy to gain consensus on it and avoid conflict, which, while it could be a good thing, it also provides leeway for powerful international organizations to then use it to influence educational agendas around the world. And therefore, how does neoliberal ideology espouse equity? It does so in three key ways. First is that it espouses a top-down conceptualization of equity, which means that it does not discuss equity from the bottom. Now, equity from the bottom is the idea that all voices in the community, in the society, must be heard. Every agency and every voice has the right to be recognized, and critiques of ESD propound that it actually does not do so. Secondly, it advocates for equity as economic growth. Now, the neoliberal framework advocates that as economies grow, so does their financial capital, which then trickles down to the individual to end in social equity, which means that the idea of social equity here is largely understood as increased per capita income and an increased standard of living. But also it means that there is an unrestricted right to exploitation of resources for consumptions by state and as an extension by individuals to achieve this economic growth. This is now tied into the third idea, which is that it sees equity as fair distribution of natural resources. This is very typically seen in international climate change negotiation, whereby equity is often associated with equitable distribution of the global carbon mitigation target and so on. Now, what this predominant conceptualization of equity has done is that it has allowed nature to simply be reduced as a resource for human consumption, and which again is the very neoliberal idea that considers greater consumption to be indicative of economic growth. And this is what has led to the idea that natural resources, which are actually very finite, are infinite in nature and meant for human consumption. So then I argue that there are two intersectional approaches that we could adopt so that we can reimagine equity in a more broader format when we think of education for sustainable development. First is the idea of reflexivity. Here, I argue that we need to be reflexive around what we mean by sustainability. Sustainability needs to be thought of as a frame of mind rather than as a thought policy, which means that we need to re-envisage how we see our relationship with nature. We need to see it at par with our human relationships. Secondly, it means that we need to go for an alternative conception of what the good life is. This is what the scholar Selby has spoken around the idea of education for sustainable contraction, which is based on ideas of sufficiency and resisting tendencies of consumerism. The second is the idea of eco-justice education. Here I speak about an education for the environment rather than about the environment. So I argue that intentional language framing around justice is very important, because what it does is that it makes it less interpretive and therefore undoes the elusiveness that exists around the concept of ESD. More importantly, it raises the question of justice for what or justice for whom, which means that every time you talk about justice, you will automatically tackle and dabble in question of injustices, whether it's towards the environment or towards nature. Therefore, it engages learners in a process of unlearning, taking a step back to critically assess ideologies and experiences that they've been shaped by, dabbling in questions of power and hegemony in the world. So what an eco-justice education in its essence does is it is premised very much in lived situations and the present. It does not rely on speaking about global changes that could happen as a result of international agreements or summits. Therefore, it very much exposes learners to the messy reality and complicated nature of environmental issues, including climate change. So in terms of conclusions and thoughts moving forward, I have argued that education for sustainable development and sustainable development both are entrenched within the same hegemonic ideology of neoliberalism that maintains its dominion by being flexible enough to actually subsume concepts such as equity. So what needs to be done is that we need to think about more themes that could broaden that idea. And in this paper, I explore reflexivity and eco-justice. Of course, these cannot be the two only themes to do so, and therefore further critical reflections on ESD are very much required. So ESD could definitely have the potential for transformation and become more equitable. But for that, we need to think about the idea of intersectionality and breaking down silos and working across disciplines.